Hello everybody and welcome back to another vlog. So, not too long ago, I watched through all of the Sam Raimi films. Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. Should clarify that. Sam Raimi is the director. So the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films were the films made from 2002, 2004 and 2007. They were the first, big superhero film. And basically, I watched through all of those, and I then started to compare it to Homecoming. So, what do I do? Well, today I've watched through pretty much all of Homecoming. I skipped out the final boss fight. Do they call them that in films? Do they call them the final boss fight? So I watched through pretty much all the way over until the climax with the fight, because I've seen the fight before, I don't really need to see it again. It's not really got any character moments. It's plot related, but it's not character moments. So I watched through pretty much everything else, especially anything related to Peter Parker, and I started to think about if I had made the Spider-Man Homecoming, the Tom Holland origin story, if I had made it as a film, how would I have done it? Because technically he needs one. Now, before I get started, I know that they wanted to not do an origin story because it had already been done twice before. And they got rid of stuff like, for instance, like the spider bite, Uncle Ben's death, and the swinging. Pretty much all of it, the swinging cinematics, which I think actually are really fun to watch. I don't know, maybe that's because I've watched Into the Spider-Verse, and I've now just seen how cool it was, and then with Sam Raimi films, how some of the swinging scenes look amazing. So I think those are kind of not important to the cinematic structure and all of that, and technically can save on time by not including them, but they just cement Spider-Man because he's swinging around New York, and yeah, anyway. So obviously I want to try and start at the beginning. Now I think I'm mostly going to mix together stuff from try to focus more onto what the comics have, but maybe going into things that I think this other origin stories have done with the character, which I think work really nicely. So obviously, I feel like the first act, so about the first 25% of the film, should really be focused on Peter Parker and him not being a superhero. And then we need to establish who Peter Parker is. And this is pretty much important to any Spider-Man film, especially for the first major film, that we see Peter Parker as Peter Parker, not Spider-Man. Because Peter Parker is who he is, Spider-Man is his alternate version of himself. Going with kind of the comics, I believe he goes to a science fair where a spider gets caught up in the radioactive experiment and then bites him. Personally, I would have also done a neat little Easter egg of having him not kill the spider, so it actually runs off. Maybe we don't see it bite someone, but I think with Silk, this is what I'm trying to reference, so that the spider might have gone and then bitten Silk, whoever Silk actually is. I don't know her character very well, or really at all. I know she's another Spider-Woman that was bitten by the same radioactive spider that Peter Parker was. So, potentially leaving that doorway open that she can be introduced. I would also show Uncle Ben, and in particular have Uncle Ben around for not a lot of scenes, but have him well-rounded in a way that we can see him as a good person. Maybe introduce Feast, or something like that, and have him doing, good things, and show him as a role model or someone at least that Peter cares about a lot. I feel like with the Sam Raimi films, for instance, there wasn't really enough time spent with Uncle Ben that we feel the emotion of his death. I don't know how many scenes he's in, but I don't think he actually has that many moments. I think he's only in it for 20 minutes-ish. He's not in it for very long. Peter gets his powers of being able to climb walls and Spidey sense. Now, whilst Spidey sense does exist in the with Tom Holland Spider-Man, I remember those people, or a few people at least, I know, pointed out how in Homecoming there is no evidence that Peter Parker has Spidey sense, but there are in the two films he was a side character of, being Civil War and Infinity War. Both of those ending in war. Because in Civil War, he noticed when Bucky was going to throw a big lump of metal at him. And in Infinity War, probably the most obvious version is when his sleeves rolled up and we see all the hairs on his arm go up. But if you actually look at the fight on the ferry when he's dealing with the arms dealers, he does actually notice and dodge Shocker's punch, as well as notice two guys drawing their weapons behind him, in which he used a motorbike to flip that on top of them. Both of those are examples of him using Spidey sense, it's just not super clear. Obviously we would then have him become a wrestler and try to profit off of his powers like he does in the comics, because he's a teenager with superpowers, what else are you going to do? Potentially even maybe he starts up a YouTube channel, something like that, a very teenager thing to do. Look at me, I've been doing this for years. Still haven't gotten anywhere with it. Yeah, and he tries to do something like that, like setting up cameras and stuff like that, and trying to take videos of him being Spider-Man. I would have also introduced the Daily Bugle. Maybe not Jameson, but definitely introduced the Bugle, because they're just so important to the Spider-Man character. Like, I believe they were in the second comic, when he actually was trying to be the good guy. They weren't in the first one, because the first one ends with Uncle Ben's death. It's not actually a whole lot of him being Spider-Man. He doesn't even stop a crime. He catches one person, Uncle Ben's killer. I would also probably show Uncle Ben's death, because then obviously it has a bit of emotion connected to it, but it could also be done that he doesn't see it. But I think what worked quite nicely with at least Sam Raimi's one was the fact that there were more than just he let the criminal get away. It was that Uncle Ben went to pick him up because of a lie Peter told. Thus there were two instances that led to Uncle Ben's death. Yeah, so Peter feels even more responsible for the death of Uncle Ben. But yeah, so I would have had Peter as a wrestler for one bit, and then I believe he goes on to TV for a bit. So maybe having him, as I said, on TV, or for instance YouTube, could work much better. Then obviously he starts taking responsibility for it. All through this point, or maybe not yet, but when he starts taking responsibility, you know, he's going around, maybe he's stopping drug dealers and stuff like that, we then get introduced to our villain. And this is where I was a bit iffy, because I was kind of trying to think of someone who we haven't seen in a film, or well, a film format yet. Because I was like, well, we've had Green Goblin, we've had Venom, Sandman, Dr. Octopus, we've now had Vulture, and Electro, who originally was going to be the one I wanted to go for. And we're now going to get Mysterio. So thinking, okay, who haven't we done that could be interesting? And whilst I haven't encountered him yet reading through the comics, I know him from the game, and it was either going to be Tombstone or Hammerhead, which I mostly think that Hammerhead would be very interesting. Hammerhead, as far as I'm aware from the games, because that's the only one I have as a point of reference, he's the leader of like a mob or some sort of mafia, and that could be interesting, as Peter's more focused on street crime and stuff like that, and, you know, robberies and things like that, would have a knock-on effect to Hammerhead, which the Avengers and the big league superheroes wouldn't be interested in. A bit like what Vulture was, except for, you know, organised crime, way it is all. But yeah, and those two things kind of build up, but what I would do is, for instance, Peter gets kind of on the trail of Hammerhead, but over this, something that is really important, and Spider-Man 2, I think, nailed it, but also parts of the comics show this quite well as what, along with this, is that being a superhero is really hard and not very fun. That's kind of what Spider-Man shows. If you watch Spider-Man 2, you see that his grades are falling, he can't hold the relationship, he's always kind of gone, they don't really know who he is anymore, because he's always working, and just all of that. And in the comics, because Uncle Ben's dead, there's no one to pay the rent anymore, so Peter tries to get a job, and he decides to try and work for the Fantastic Four, which obviously can't be done with the MCU because they don't own the rights to Fantastic Four, weirdly enough. The MCU doesn't, but yeah. But what happened was he went to try and join the Fantastic Four. He beat all of them, single-handed, and when he found out that they were non-profit, refused to join them and went and left, basically immediately. And I believe it was after this point where it's got him walking through an alleyway and even though it's a thought bubble, it says that he's sobbing. Like, you know, he's scared that he's gonna lose, that Aunt May and him obviously are gonna lose the house, and there's every person in New York seems to hate him and think that he's a criminal. And in a way, that's kind of what also motivates him to be a superhero, is to be a hero, not a villain, to try and prove Jameson wrong. That's what he wants. He wants to prove Jameson wrong. He is a good guy at heart. That's kind of still part of who he is. He is still a good person. But for instance, in comics, he gets annoyed at, like, Flash. At one point, he attacks him actually a couple of times, I think, but he always backs down because he realizes, for instance, if he punched Flash, which he does at one point in the comic, where he punched him as lightly as he could, and he sent him flying out of the ring, where he went, if he actually full-on used his proper strength and punched him as if he was a normal person, he has a very good chance of killing Flash if he did that. But he gets annoyed at people. When he goes to university, he's often... All of the characters, like Gwen Stacy and Harry Osborn, have now been introduced. And when I saw them, I was like, oh, yay, he's going to finally get a friend, because he doesn't have a friend for 4 years? Yeah, because 1962, and this is somewhere between 1964 and 1966. So, very early on still, so I think it's around about still 1964. For, 2 years, he hasn't had a single friend, or even mentioned that he ever had a friend. So, that's great. So, when I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, he's finally going to get a friend. No, Harry hates him, Gwen hates him, because they think that because he won an award that got him into university for free, that he's just really cocky about it. This is the thing with Spider-Man, because of his power. Whilst he's not, he's actually distracted because Aunt May is sick and potentially might die. He's very focused on just that, and because of that, everyone thinks that he's just ignoring them and thinks he's better than them. And I think that's still something that's kind of important to how you do a Spider-Man film, is in some ways a bit like the miscommunication because he has to keep stuff secret. Well, fair enough, he could have mentioned that, but he never did in the end. But also, it's kind of like the good guy is the one that everyone hates. Because as Spider-Man and as Peter Parker, he's always getting bullied and pushed down no matter how hard he tries. And I think that would be something that I really want to focus on in this film is, for instance, if he did something like, for instance, with his friend... Is his friend Ben? I just watched the film and I can't remember his friend's... But yeah, like, for instance, if he'd been holding off going off with him to, I don't know, build Lego stuff like he did, build Lego, or not going to parties anymore, or even seeing him quitting all of the clubs, it works as a way that we can see that his time as Spider-Man is taking over everything else. We can see him being late with homework and getting into trouble. And I think, for instance, if he needs to have consequences for him being Spider-Man, and they need to be negative and permanent in a way. When he annoys his friends for not being there, they hold that against him, and they get annoyed at him. Aunt May worrying because of the fact that he's not calling in, or stuff like that. Also, Peter's motive. Watching through Homecoming, his main focus was literally impressing the Avengers. That's never been his reason of being a superhero. He never wanted to impress anyone because nobody knew who he was. As I said, for 4 years, because he still hasn't told a single person, for 4 years, nobody knows he's Spider-Man. At one point, he thought he was going insane because of his double identity. He thought he was losing his mind. He wasn't, he was being tricked by Mysterio, but still, he thought he was genuinely going to go mad. Because of the fact, literally nobody knows who he is. He can't talk about this to anyone. I feel like there needs to be that thing where he feels there's a lot of pressure on him and he can't talk to anyone about it. This kind of, give him this feeling of isolation. There's a consequence and stuff like that for, not being with his friends. I would also try to make him a bit more awkward in a way. Whilst I'm not too worried, and technically part of his arc over that is becoming a little bit more confident, but kind of as a side effect of being Spider-Man, he becomes a little bit more confident as Peter Parker, which is kind of where we end up with him in Homecoming. And anyway, and all of this kind of builds up eventually to the big climax thing where afterwards he tries to resolve everything, or even then it's kind of just before that where he's able to try and he stops for a bit or something, where he kind of gives up and finally feels defeated enough. Maybe he fights Hammerhead and loses, and a bit like what happened with Dr. Octopus, who was the first villain to properly defeat him. And it wasn't like something like, for instance, with the Sandman, where Peter accidentally stuck his fingers to his face, and when he pulled his hand away, he ripped the mask open, so he had to run off because his face was exposed. Dr. Octopus was the first person to properly defeat him without really any trouble, and because of that he felt like quitting, because he lost that fight so quickly. And that could work. He fights Hammerhead, thinks he can win, tries to, loses horribly, and just kind of quits for a little while. I don't think for the full length of, obviously, as long as he did is something like Spider-Man 2, but long enough that we can kind of get to see him trying to put his life back on track. A little bit like what Homecoming does, where it has this little section where he finishes the Death Star with Ben, and then he also, he does work and is still doing stuff at the school. He's not skipping stuff, because he's kind of stopped, he's had this suit taken away from him. But basically, I would just extend that out a little bit. Also, maybe show him in the debate club a little bit more, with a crush still on Liz, but not actually getting the confidence to tell her or anything. Costume, this is obviously a very important thing. And I wouldn't give him the fantasy suit. Technically, because his spandex suit technically doesn't exist. Yeah, I did think about it. I was like, well, Peter sewed his own suit, even though he's rubbish at sewing in the comics. He made his own suit. I was like, oh yeah, so he could do that. But I think whilst that would make sense to have him try and sew his own costume, and I was thinking, oh yeah, I could actually have it where, for instance, he maybe has a costume a bit like the non-CGI version from Civil War. You actually see it has a pretty cool design. I actually kind of like the little bit of like the raised webbing on it, and I think it was a bit of a darker red and blue, but it looked really nice, and it was like a complete costume, and then they covered the entire thing with CGI in the production, whatever. I should know this. But I really liked his homemade suit. Personally, I think it's one of the best homemade suits that he's ever had out of all of the different versions that he's had over the years. I think it's the best looking one in my mind, because it's still got the colours. It has that kind of Spider-Man-ish look, but it's not... It's like on the way to being the Spider-Man look. So what I would have done is I would have had it where the costume go... Basically, he has the wrestling costume, maybe, which is maybe like a red shirt and jeans or something. But, like, after that, when he gets like the $100 or whatever from the wrestling match, he takes that money and buys the rest of this costume. And then obviously with the mask, potentially actually with the mask with just eye holes, not the goggles, or whatever they are, and then later adds those on. That will add obviously a bit of a development phase to the costume building, and we see it slowly morph more and more as it goes on. Also, the web shooters. He has to make those. We have to see him make them. There was basically nothing shown that he was actually capable of making bits of technology by himself. So I think the fact that, we see him making the web shooters and inventing the web fluid, and just see him working on this suit and being, smarter than Tony Stark. I don't actually know how smart he is compared to other characters. He just has less of a budget. As for the end credits scene, very important to have that end credits scene. I think there will be two. One of them is where he's potentially trying to sell his photos to the Daily Bugle. He's got a phone, a brilliant portable camera. Or, as I said, just continue with the YouTube channel idea and social media and trying to make profit through posting stuff. And then the other one, at least, would be basically when he comes back to Aunt May's apartment and finds Tony Stark. That scene in Civil War. Basically a tiny bit of the very beginning of that scene, just to tease that one. I think Ant-Man had already teased it, but still. I think the main themes of it is kind of that idea of trying to choose who you want to be. It's obviously coming of age. I don't know, I think it was Cinema Wins. Yes, I watched Cinema Wins. Said when they were talking about Into the Spider-Verse, that a lot of people say that the spider powers are a metaphor for puberty. And yeah, sure, there's obviously a very good argument that you can make about that. But I love what he said, because it could also be compared, at least now, potentially not in the 60s, because 1962 is when it started. My grandparents got married in 1962. So obviously back then this wouldn't have probably been what the metaphor was for, but it might have been and just never been mentioned. He mentioned it could be for people, like for instance, someone who's in LGBT. You feel like you can't talk about it. It's something inside you. It's a kind of second part to your personality that you maybe don't show to everyone. You keep secret apart from people who are very close to you. I think the Spider-Verse version works better because it's like finding out there are other people like you and stuff like that, which Homecoming and, normal Peter Parker doesn't have. But, I don't know, you could argue that either way. But the idea of trying to kind of fit in, obviously, with the idea that, he's in school, I would probably feature more scenes at school. And I think there should be a bit more of a focus onto Flash as well. So, for instance, showing Flash is, yes, still a bully, but obviously when Spider-Man starts showing up on like the internet and all of that, having Flash as this massive fan where he's like, oh yeah, I completely support him, and all of that stuff. And saying he's like the coolest superhero and all of that, because, that's what he thinks in the comics as well. I think just kind of to end this, this video was mostly just made just kind of because I thought, well, if there was an origin story for Spider-Man, what would it be? For Tom Holland's Spider-Man. And, I don't know, let me know what you think, if you think that would be a cool idea. Watching through it, there's so much stuff where I'm there like, oh yeah, there's Betty Brant. I nearly missaid that. Betty Brant, who worked at the Daily Bugle but is now like 15 for some reason and not like... Wait, hang on, how old was she? Because they dated for a bit and he wanted to marry her, but he was like... He was probably 15. She was a receptionist with a full-time job. So she would have been like 18 minimum, potentially 20. Wow, that is weird. I never realised that. Okay, maybe that change was actually good, considering the fact that she would have been an adult and he would have still been mid-teens. Never realised that. But yeah, but I think like the Daily Bugle should have been there. And whilst I don't mind Harry not being there, they can introduce him later on. Technically he was introduced later on in the comics anyway. And I feel like they should really start looking at maybe some of the smaller villains. Because they've already kind of tackled the big ones, they're going to have to start going back over some of the villains they've already introduced, like Sandman and Dr. Octopus and all these other villains. They're going to have to kind of reintroduce them at some point because you're going to run out of villains. Like, Molten Man is there, but, you know, he's not the best villain, I would say. I don't know. Power Cinema, you could probably change it. I think that's why I'm just going to leave this off now. I don't really think there's anything left for me to talk about, and if there is, I'm very annoyed because I have forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.